Saints Row is one of my all-time favorite franchises, and its evolution is fascinating. What began as a more quirky alternative to the Grand Theft Auto series ended as a stupendous spectacle of silliness when Volition realized that the realistic approach would quickly doom their franchise to a Medal of Honor demise. If you showed someone the first scene from the first game, followed immediately by the final scene from Get Outta Hell, you'd have a real tough time convincing them that they're bookends to a single series.
Fans of this franchise seem split right down the middle on which era of Saints Row they think is superior, so when we finally get Saints Row 5, I hope it somehow manages to toe the line and please everybody, because happy people and more Saints Row are two things I could really use right now.
But in the meantime, let's talk about one of the franchise's defining aspects, the gangs. Every game in this series is based around slowly but steadily taking over as much of the map as you can, and in the first 3 games, you did that at the expense of a variety of opposing street gangs. And today, we're going to rank these ostentatious outlaw organizations from worst to best. Keep in mind that we're only looking at the gangs, so the likes of the Police, Altor, Stag, the Zin, and the Armies of Hell do not qualify. Also, to keep things interesting, I'm not including the 3rd Street Saints themselves, because they'd obviously take the top spot with little resistance. That leaves us with 9 games to talk about, and I'll be judging each group on their respective styles, activities, storylines, characters, and impact on the series as a whole. But enough meandering, let's get to the mayhem.
It's a mayhem! No, not that one.
Even though it's my favorite game in the series and one of my favorite games of all time, I'd be a fool to ignore the fact that Saints Row III has by far the weakest trio of gangs. While the other games have individual storylines for each group you go against, Saints Row III features one overarching plot where all 3 gangs work together under the banner of the Syndicate, which means that each gang itself suffers as a result. Traditional aspects of Saints Row gangs such as lieutenants and gang activities are pretty much ignored as all 3 gangs just focus on fighting the Saints. And no gang in this game suffers harder than the Morningstar. The Morningstar controlled a booming prostitution business in Steelport, and at the start of the game are the de facto leaders of the Syndicate. They serve as your primary antagonists for the first half of the game, and while they are involved in a few really fun missions, they themselves are rarely the focal point and are basically there as just cannon fodder while you learn the ropes. And while to their credit, they're the only gang in the game to have actual characters as lieutenants rather than just nameless specialists, that doesn't change the fact you'll basically be done with these guys by the halfway point of the game. The leader of the Morningstar is Philippe Laurent, who outside of his introduction and eventual death, is featured in exactly 1 cutscene in the entire game. At least he goes out in a funny way, which is at least more than can be said for his Lieutenant Kiki.
Kilbane!
This little neck massage gone awry causes Kiki's sister Viola to turn on the Syndicate and join the Saints, and that effectively puts an end to any relevance the Morningstar had in this game's plot. But speaking of Viola, she is by far the best thing about the entire Morningstar. Not only does she end up joining the 3rd Street Saints, but the missions that she takes part in are some of my favorites in the entire game, and the banter she has with the likes of Oleg and Pierce is a ton of fun.
It also helps that she's voiced brilliantly by Sasha Grey, and you know what? I think that's where we're going to end this segment before somebody, namely me, gets in any kind of trouble.
You don't have to look any farther than the first cutscene of the first game to understand my feelings towards number 8.
Man, fuck the rollers.
Well said, nameless Vice King.
Hailing from the suburbs of northwest Stillwater, the West Side Rollers are a group of rich kids turned street racers and tuners who steal cars. That's basically it. Heck, outside of Price's Etrazioni, those cars aren't even all that impressive. They're the smallest gang in the original Saints Row with the fewest missions and the least amount of turf. Outside of drag racing and fighting the Saints, they don't do a darn thing. I mean, there is that business deal hinted at between William Sharp and some foreign buyers, but after Sharp is killed off, that thread is left hanging, never to be resolved. On the subject of Sharp, not only does he feel really out of place even amongst the rich kid gang, he just sounds bored the entire time. His nephew Joseph Price at least feels like he belongs in a gang of street racers, but he doesn't do anything in the story aside from attempting and failing to gain revenge for his uncle's death. There's also Price's best friend Donnie, a timid mechanic who somehow manages to survive being in 2 different gangs on this list.
That's called foreshadowing.
Finally, there's Lynn, but she doesn't count seeing as she was an undercover saint the whole time. But speaking of Lynn, the only thing keeping the Rollers from the bottom spot on this list is the fact that they are one of only a few gangs in the series who managed to kill off a saint that stays dead. I'm looking at you, Morningstar. But even that isn't enough to redeem them, especially since they're also the only gang in the series to lose all their turf before the end of their story.
I know this is kind of low-hanging fruit, but in a game where the other two gangs are some of the best the series has ever produced, and we will get to them later, the West Side Rollers ain't nothing but a third wheel.
I love professional wrestling, and clearly Volition does as well. The third and fourth games in the series are chock full of wrestling moves, taunts, and references to satisfy anybody's inner mark. There's also been quite a few legends of the business to voice characters in these games, including the likes of Hulk Hogan, Rob Van Dam, Christopher Daniels, and a full-on appearance by the late great Rowdy Roddy Piper.
I don't tell many people this, but there was a time in the mid-90s that I was a fourth member of a Latin music group called the Rodriguez Vipers. We sang a cappella versions of classic Central American folk songs, hit the top 40 in the Latin music charts twice.
Really?
Nope, but the great thing about you not knowing much about me is I can tell you bullshit like that.
I would eat a trash can for that man any day.
So with all this love for the history of wrestling and its culture, why in the name of Adam Cole's departed soul are the Luchadores so lame? The Luchadores are the muscle of the Syndicate in Saints Row the Third and the final gang you will fight in the story. The biggest problem with these guys is just how bland they are. Luchadors are historically smaller and more agile wrestlers, and yet everyone in this gang is a meathead in combat gear, and their specialist is by far the least interesting. He's just slightly bigger and he's got a grenade launcher. Whoop-de-doo. Their business ventures are gambling and steroid dealing, but only the former is dealt with in missions as you raid and take over their casino stronghold. They also drive nothing but big trucks, which are not ideal if you need to hijack a ride for a quick getaway.
These walking, talking blocks of testosterone would have been a shoo-in for last place if not for the single best thing about them. And what is that?
The best. The best is beating Sway the Spider God in a Tijuana scaffold match. The best is defending the world title 13 times in one night. The best is winning a last man standing match with 2 broken legs. Trust me, little Icarus. You're flying too close to the sun.
This is such good shit.
Oh yes, I love a good heel in wrestling, and Killbane might just be my favorite villain in the entire series. Everything from the way he talks with his constant wrestling and Greek mythology references to his hilariously sinister voice makes this guy a total riot, a perfect mix of threat and ham. It's just a shame that he's got nothing to work with but jobbers and enhancement talent. This is a very unpopular opinion, but Saints Row 2 is probably my least favorite game in the series. I'm not saying it's bad, far from it. Saints Row 2 is amazing. It's just that of all the games in the franchise, this is the one I go back to the least. This is mainly because my copy on the Xbox 360 has a nasty habit of freezing on me in moments of high pressure, and it makes long play sessions kind of risky. That and the fact that this is the game where they tried to walk the tightrope between realistic and over the top, before the third game just said screw it and went full on with the stupid. It creates a mood that I sometimes struggle to get immersed in. It's like picking your least favorite Ninja Turtle. You love them all, but somebody's gotta come in last.
But even though I prefer the other games, I won't deny that Saints Row 2 has probably the most well-rounded group of gangs to go against, including number 6 on this list, the Brotherhood.
Of all the gangs in Saints Row, the Brotherhood might be the most terrifyingly simple. They're big scary arms dealers with big scary tattoos that drive big scary cars and run big scary extortion schemes. If they want something, they take it. And if somebody tries to stop them, they die.
Any questions?
This gang of malicious metalheads is masterminded by a man named Marrow, and while he isn't as entertaining as Killbane, he's definitely a lot scarier. Marrow is such a hard bastard that he gets toxic waste tattooed into his face and walks it off like nothing happened, which only reinforces the justification of bringing him back in Saints Row 4. And like the Rollers before them, Marrow and his Brotherhood are one of the few gangs in the series to successfully kill off a member of the Saints. But unlike the Rollers, who took out Lynn in a fairly tame way, The demise Carlos suffers at the hands of the tough cats with the tribal tats is as gruesome a way to go as anyone gets in the entire franchise. You of course get your payback by tricking Mario into turning his girlfriend into a car trunk pancake, and really that's all the story is in a nutshell. You stop an arms deal at one point and marvel at how Donnie of all people fell in with and outlived these guys, but basically the entire Brotherhood story boils down into increasing acts of violence as each boss does his best to out-brutal the other. There's not a lot of nuance, but hey, if I was looking for nuance, I wouldn't be messing with these guys. You might have noticed that in each game, there's always one gang that specializes in a unique brand of criminal activity when compared to their counterparts. The first game had the Rollers and their underwhelming automobile escapades, the second game had the Brotherhood and their blackmail and big guns, and the third game has the goth pack that loves to hack, known as the Deckers. While not as relevant to the story as their syndicate counterparts, the Deckers are definitely more interesting. Never at the top of the food chain in Steelport, the Deckers are usually found working behind the scenes to aid in the plans of both Philippe and later Killbane. Whether they're hacking into banks to drain the Saints' saving accounts, or crashing helicopters to halt Shandy from hitting a headshot, the Deckers are a constant thorn in the side of the Saints during their time in Steelport. And at no point does that thorn poke harder than when dealing with a Decker specialist. Not only have these crazy chicks been playing way too much Jet Set Radio, they also move at blinding speeds and somehow manage to get their hands on freaking gravity hammers. Luckily, to combat these cyber crooks, you enlist the help of Kinsey Kensington, a contender for the most popular Saint in the series that isn't voiced by Daniel Day Kim. She does this by not only helping you take over a nuclear power plant, but by basically sending you into the Matrix to take on Decker's top dog in one of the best boss fights in the series. Speaking of the Deckers' head honcho, let's talk about Matt Miller. A self-described cyber god, Miller turns out to be a total wuss when he can't hide behind his keyboard. He cuts a deal with the boss by getting them a discount on either cars or guns, and then has the sense to leave town peacefully. He returns in Saints Row 4 as an ally working for MI6, and from that point on he's a valued member of the Saints. Not bad for a guy who writes Nightblade fanfiction.
Stay off the weed!
In every Saints Row game with rival gangs, there's always one gang centered around dealing drugs, and no gang commits harder to this theme than Saints Row 2's Sons of Samedi. With their roots stemming from the Caribbean underworld, these potheads with locked up dreads filled the drug void left behind after the first game.
The way I would describe the Sons of Samedi is kind of like the opposite of the Luchadores. With the Luchadores, you got a whole lot of nothing and a really great boss. With the Sons of Samedi, you have a really great gang with a kind of underwhelming boss.
The man in charge of this gaggle of gangsters in green is known simply as the General, and he likes to spend his time riding around in the back of an armored limousine and occasionally cutting people's ears off. So while the head honcho isn't much to write home about, the rest of the gang more than makes up for it with their cool designs and sweet rides. Their missions are also a ton of fun, including a prison break, burning a weed farm from a helicopter, and surviving a massive gunfight whilst high as a kite.
How you feeling?
Comfortable. And very hungry.
Lastly, let's talk about these guys, the Lieutenants. On one hand, you have Veteran Child, a triple platinum DJ for one of the game's radio stations and an ex-boyfriend of Shandy. He's a total wimp that basically goes out with no resistance. But any character voiced by the insanely talented Neil Patrick Harris deserves another shot. And so Veteran Child made his long-awaited return in Saints Row 4, only to get shot down both literally and figuratively by both versions of Shandy. Now on the other hand, we have this charming fellow. His name is Mr. Sunshine, and he's the runaway favorite for the title of creepiest character in all of Saints Row. Sunshine's voice is like a cold knife on your neck, and he has this nasty penchant for hacking first and asking questions later, and I don't mean in the way that Deckers do it. Add to the fact that he possesses voodoo powers and can walk off a dozen gunshot wounds, and Sunshine is the last character in all of Saints Row that I would want to meet in a dark alley at midnight.
And for those of you wondering, yes, Andy Zen would be first on that list. Ranking the top 3 gangs on this list was hard, because all of them excel in pretty much every category. I went back and forth with each one multiple times before finally deciding on who should go where. So at number 3, we have the Ronin.
When it comes to my personal preferences in Saints Row gangs, the Ronin hits a lot of the right notes. Their design is awesome, with cool jackets and shades, and the best logo in the entire franchise. Carrying swords on their back into combat is also a nice touch, and their souped up motorcycles and cars are way cooler than anything the West Side Rollers were ever able to come up with. Couple this with their connections to Altor and the police, and if every Saints Row 2 gang decided to go at it, I think the Ronin would be the betting favorite to be the last gang standing. Their case is further helped by the fact they have Junichi as an enforcer, who I think is the best lieutenant the series has ever produced. He's a man of honor, but is also a ruthless killer, as shown when he promises to not kill Aisha as long as she keeps quiet. This of course doesn't happen, as Aisha tries to warn the boss and Johnny Gat, and this results in the Ronin being another one of the select few gangs to successfully kill off a saint. Speaking of Gat, he is involved in a majority of the campaign against the Ronin. There aren't as many standout missions as there are with the Brotherhood and the Sons of Samdi, but when you have the greatest gangbanger in gaming gunning down goons by the group, that's easy to forgive.
Also, Pierce plays a role, but as the intro to Saints Row 3 so eloquently explains, nobody cares about Pierce.
Really, the only thing that keeps the Ronin from being higher on the list and having a shot at the top spot is the weakness of their leaders, the Akujis. And I don't mean weak as a character like in the case of the General. I'm talking about how the flaws in their personalities work against the Ronin as a whole. Shogo, the son, is a slimy little brat that doesn't command a lot of respect, but he understands the ways of the West enough to land a good deal with Alter to cement the Ronin's position. Kazuo, his father, is intimidating enough that even Johnny Gat refers to him as a boogeyman, but his inability to grasp how what works in Japan doesn't work in Stillwater leads to Alter cutting ties with his organization, which only helps the Saints even more.
It's fascinating how between these two there could have been a perfect gang leader, but instead of bringing out each other's strengths, they only accentuate each other's weaknesses.
Kazuo's complete disdain for his son leads to Shogo setting up Junichi out of jealousy, while Shogo's increasing attempts to get his father's approval eventually lead to him suffering the most morbid death in the entire series.
Jeez, that's such a brutal burial it could have made Killbane blush.
The story does end on a high note, with the boss sending Kazuo and the Ronin out in a literal blaze of glory. A fitting end for the best gang for the most popular game in the franchise. If you know this series well, then through process of elimination you would know that the final two gangs on this list are both from the original Saints Row. The first game in the series is the only one that takes itself completely seriously, and while that doesn't give it as much innate charm as later games, it does mean that your competition is treated much more like legitimate threats rather than just cannon fodder to roll over. In fact, if it weren't for the West Side Rollers being the dictionary definition of a weak link, the first set of gangs would stand unopposed as the premier trio in the franchise.
But rather than dwelling on those clowns some more, let's instead turn our attention and pay our respects to the OGs of the franchise, and number 2 on this list, the Los Carnales.
It's not the Los Carnales, it's just the Carnales.
Shut up or fuck off, ideally both in either order.
Anyone who loves this franchise should be eternally grateful to Alejandro Lopez, who might be the most important character in all of Saints Row to never actually appear in any games. With the Colombian drug cartel backing him up, Lopez formed Los Carnales and took over all of Stillwater in mere months back in the 70s. By the start of Saints Row 1, the Carnales are run by his psycho sons and their enforcer Victor, a man so tough he survived a dozen drive-bys and is able to fight off the Saints while on fire before you're finally able to finish him off. Because of their unhinged leadership and cartel support, most of the missions involving Los Carnales are rather unique, as you don't have the means to fight them directly. This is why I always recommend that they be the final gang you take on in the first Saints Row. Their story plays out in a believable way, as you're not able to get rid of them for good until you sway the Colombians to work with the Saints instead. Your case is helped by the insecurities of Angelo Lopez, whose jealousy and paranoia only hasten the collapse of his crew. In the end, everything about Los Carnales is excellent, and if it weren't for them, nothing else in Saints Row would exist. My guess is everything would be like those 50s suburb levels in Saints Row 4, and where's the fun in that? The Carnales were so very close to being number 1 on this countdown, but in the end, there can only be one king.
Puns are a crime against humanity.
Sorry, Johnny.
Yes, that's right. I'm awarding the title of Best Gang in Saints Row history to the Vice Kings. Inspired by the real-life Vice Lords of Chicago, the Vice Kings were the first group to rise up against Los Carnales, leading to the gang war that resulted in former Vice King Julius founding the 3rd Street Saints. The Vice Kings would go on to have success in various business ventures, including prostitution, arms dealing, gambling, and extortion through their record label, Kingdom Come Records. They also got themselves in good with City Hall and the Stillwater Police, meaning that the cops would typically leave them alone and focus on the other gangs in the city. The legacy of the Vice Kings is unrivaled, as they're the only gang in franchise history to have every high-ranking member return in some fashion for Saints Row 4, and there's an entire mission in that game where you finally get to return to Stillwater and take them on all over again. They're also unmatched in star power, featuring the voice talents of Michael Clark Duncan, Mila Kunis, and Terry Crews at various points.
Of those actors I just mentioned, 2 of them lend their talents to what was the deciding factor in the Vice Kings taking the top spot over Los Carnales, and that is hands down the best gang leader in the entire game. I will let him introduce himself.
You forgot who you talking to. My name is Benjamin motherfucking King.
In addition to being the coolest boss, this professional badass is also the most competent, as everything that leads to the downfall of his crew is the fault of those underneath him. On that subject, let's look at their story. Unlike every other gang that wants to go in guns blazing when the Saints start causing problems, King is wise enough to show restraint and let his connections to the cops deal with the problem. Unfortunately for King, this patience is not shared by his lieutenant and numbers guy, Warren Williams. A second-rate rapper turned third-rate gangster, Williams' desire to prove his street cred leads to him being duped by Tanya into staging a coup to take control of the gang. King himself escapes with the help of the Saints, and Tanya kills Williams to seize control for herself. But before he walks away for good, King helps the Saints take down his former crew once and for all, capped off with him getting his revenge on Tanya by dropping her out a 30-story window.
That sucks for your car.
Julius offers to let King leave Stillwater with his life, and King is smart enough to do so. After becoming a best-selling author, King would go on to make his triumphant return in Saints Row 4, where he serves as the chief of staff to the boss and is instrumental in fighting off the Zin forces. He also proves that he has some killer dance moves. Overall, everything about the Vice Kings is top quality. Their boss is the best, their story's well nuanced, their missions are a ton of fun, especially that love letter to old fans in Saints Row 4, their rides are sweet, their legacy's unmatched, everything about them is so great that I award them the title of best gang in all of Saints Row.
Hopefully when Saints Row 5 finally comes out, we'll get some new gangs that could stake their claim for the top spot. But until then, you go at the king, you best not miss. That is all.